In the last segment, we talked about the disappointment of Ray Franz when he found out what was going on back at Brooklyn headquarters, and how the Inquisition was Star Chamber hearings, the very thing that the Watchtower had gone in print to reprove as a unfaithful representation of justice, and how the biblical precedent in Deuteronomy 16 for open trials done at the gates in the cities and towns of Israel was a great precedent for how justice should proceed. But now we see these maneuverings behind the scenes in Brooklyn. So Ray continues, the chairman of the governing body of Jehovah's Witnesses had multiple opportunities to respond openly and honestly to my request for information by saying, Ray, what we feel is a very serious matter has come up, and there are even charges of apostasy being made. We think you should know that your name has been involved, and before we do anything, we thought that the only Christian thing to do was to talk to you first. Now, that's a very desirable approach, but that's not what Albert Schroeder did. Instead, he said nothing, not one word, to indicate that this was the case. Of course, he could not very well have made the latter part of that statement, since he and the other members of the Chairman's Committee had already put into motion a large-scale operation of tapings, investigating committees, and interrogations. The picture given me by the governing body representative was, plainly put, deceptive, fictitious. But I had no way of knowing then just how deceptive and fictitious it was. I soon began to learn, but primarily from sources outside the governing body. If the conduct of the governing body and its chairman's committee in this regard is difficult to understand, I consider it even more inexplicable and unjustifiable that they were not open and above board with Ed Dunlap, who was right there at the headquarters. When he asked Barry and Barr what the purpose of their interrogation was, simple fairness should have moved them to tell him why the governing body assigned them to question him, what grave charges were being made. Certainly scriptural principles, including the statement of the Lord Jesus Christ, that we should do to others as we would have them do to us, would have demanded that someone say to his face what accusations of apostasy were being made behind his back. The ones who knew this chose not to do so at that time. They chose not to do so for nearly a month thereafter. Yet his name, like mine, was passed on to the members of investigating committees and then of judicial committees to at least a dozen or more men, and still no one from the governing body approached him to tell him what grave charges were being linked to his name. Yet many of them saw him on a daily basis. I do not understand how that course of action can be considered worthy of the name Christian. On Friday, April the 25th, just 3 days after Schroeder's phone call in response to my request, judicial committees operating under the sanction and direction of the Chairman's Committee of the governing body disfellowshipped Chris Sanchez and his wife and Nestor Quillen. Renee and Elsie Vasquez were also disfellowshipped by another committee, as was an elder of a congregation adjoining that in which Renee served. The names of all except the congregation elder were read out to the entire headquarters staff, stating that they had been disfellowshipped. The governing body thus informed well over 1,500 persons. They did not see fit to inform me. I eventually heard it, of course, but from phone calls from those so treated, not from any of my fellow members of the governing body. Diane Beers, who had been serving as a member of the headquarters staff for 10 years and who was well acquainted with the Sanchez's and with the Quillens, described her impression of the events of the week of April 21st to 26th in this way. And this is a quote from Diane's letter. I think the thing that was impressed on my mind the most during that week was the cruel way these friends were being treated. They never knew when they would be required to go to a committee meeting. Suddenly the phone would ring and there would go Chris. Then he would come back. The phone would ring and there would go Nestor. On and on it went. They were kept constantly up in the air during that week. One day when I was talking to Norma, that is Chris's wife, she told me that the committee wanted her to talk to them without Chris there and that she didn't know what to do. I suggested that Chris should be there at all times because otherwise she would never have a witness to what they said to her and how she replied. They could say anything, and she would have no way of proving that it was different. It was becoming apparent that they were trying to pit Norma against Chris. Finally, on Friday afternoon, that is April the 25th, at 4:45 p.m., the committee came marching on to the 8th floor where we all worked and headed for the conference room that was directly behind my desk. That's Diane's desk. Shortly, everyone began to leave work and go home, but I stayed around to see what the outcome would be. They called Chris and Norma and Nestor and Tony in, and as they each came out, I went to see what the verdict was. I remember that when I went into Nestor's office to talk with Tony and him, they told me I'd better leave before I too got into trouble for being seen with them. I walked home by myself, fighting all the way not to break down in tears. I was just devastated. I couldn't believe what was happening. It's a feeling I will never forget. This place had been my home for many years, and I had enjoyed my time there. Now it was like I was in a place totally foreign to me. I thought about Christ saying that by their fruits you will know them, and I just couldn't reconcile what I had seen and heard about during that week as being Christian. It was so harsh and unloving. These were people who had given years and years of service to the society, had good reputations, and were much loved by everyone. And yet no mercy could be shown to them. It was incomprehensible to me. I had a meeting that evening, but I refused to go as I was just too upset. Later on that evening, when Leslie, that's Diane's roommate, had come home from the meeting, we were talking and we heard a knock at the door. This was around 11 p.m. It was Toni Quillen. She didn't even get in the door before she broke down and just sobbed. She didn't want Nestor to know how upset she was. We all sat there and cried together and talked. We let her know that she and Nestor were our friends, now the same as always, and tried to encourage her as best we could. I couldn't sleep very good that night and got up once around 2 or 3 in the morning. I just sat in the bathroom thinking about what had happened and felt like it was a nightmare. It didn't seem real to me. Saturday morning I went to see Nestor and Tony and Chris and Norma, and when I got to Quillen's room, they had just had a visit from John Booth, who was also a member of the governing body. He was sent to tell them that their appeal had been rejected by the governing body. The committee had told them Friday evening that they had to have the appeal in by the next morning at 8 a.m. This in itself was ridiculous, but they complied and had an appeal in by 8 a.m. Booth was sent to tell them no. Nestor asked him why, and he told him that he, that is Booth, was just a messenger boy. He had made it obvious that he did not want to discuss anything with any of them. So, one thinks again of the contrast between this procedure, this behind-the-scenes maneuvering, and Acts 15, let's say, where, of course, the Watchtower gets its concept of the governing body, which, if you read Acts, is a one-off. There's no other record that any of the congregations in, let's say, Paul and Barnabas and Silas's missionary tours had recourse to go back to Jerusalem to adjudicate anything. So even in Acts 15, though, if there is a governing body, it consists of not only the apostles, but it says in the text, the elders. And when Paul and Barnabas find themselves under accusation for their work among the Gentiles, all the apostles and James and the other elders in Jerusalem are present. And it makes the point that a great debate broke out. Now this way of governing the church, if we just concede for a minute that there was a governing body in the first century, is so markedly different. First of all, there's multiple points of view present at this governing body meeting in Acts 15. And there's debate, public debate, with apparently many brothers present. So even that is a marked difference from what we see going on here, where not even the dozen or so members of the governing body are all present for the discussion. Some being obviously left aside as of little importance to the adjudication that's being determined. So in the next segment we'll continue the report from Ray and note his contrast of this style of procedure with the precedents of the New Testament, and while we're at it, we should also discuss the difference between what we see here as a style of governance and what we even see in Judaism in the first century. Again, a marked difference, which might account for the fact that the governing body, if there was one in the first century, has this openness that the governing body of the Watchtower never did have and never will have.